when something is mandatory, even if I support it, it pulls the hackles on the back of my neck, because I do think we need choice. You always need choices, options. So we are going to end up with the ever more regulated world and the ever more libertarian world. But as long as the two can coexist, that's kind of okay in my mind. It's when one tries to say, well, the other won't exist. That's where you've got this polarization going on. And that's where you get conflict, and that's where you get trouble.
You're listening to Getting It Wrong to Get It Right.
Gary Nuttall is an emerging technology consultant. He specialises in helping organisations explore and utilise data with emerging technologies such as blockchain. He is a sought-after speaker and trainer, delivering keynote speeches, workshops and masterclasses. Gary, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you on. I look forward to chatting with you. Really want to touch on blockchain, want to touch on the digital currency that's facing our way. There is a battle between people holding on to cash and governments and central banks trying to push people in a direction that suits them. And whatever other way our conversation is going to meander along the way. So I'm looking forward to having this call with you.
Joe, thank you very much for inviting me onto the program. And I too looking forward to this. Some of the topics you talked about there, whether it be blockchain, crypto, government-backed digital currencies or whatever, it does feel as though we are about to cross the point of no return with many of these things. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Yeah, and it's even, there's globalism, there's like someone said to me the other day, with all this, blockchain and with technology streaming along, and then the digital currency, is there going to be the massive shift of wealth ever seen in history? Those who have and those who will not have not, and regulations and laws that are being put on people. And as someone said to me, it's like a boiling frog, putting a frog in cold water and turning it up. The frog won't move, but it eventually will boil. And I've said this many a time. Are we giving up our comfort? Are we giving up our freedom for control? So, the comfort creatures, we're shown more, but we're actually giving up our freedom for that at the end of it, at the day of it.
I'd kind of argue in a way that we're not giving up our freedom. We've already given it up. It's just that we didn't notice it had happened. And when we look at many things now, whether it's the amount of surveillance cameras that are watching us, or the amount of extra effort that you have to go to do a bank transaction, which in theory is for good intent. The whole thing that Europe's introduced a whole raft of new regulations around payments, about secondary identity and verification and all this. And on the face of it, it kind of looks really good. It looks like it's to protect the consumer, reduce fraud, and you hear all of these things. But like any other technology innovation, there are good ways of using things and there are not so good. And so in some ways, I think we've given up an awful lot of our privacy and security without even noticing it. And it is exactly as you say, it's for the convenience factor that we don't notice it.
Yeah, I listened to my mother, God rest her soul, and, other people who would be now in their 80s and 90s and say, oh, we had it better in our day. And you'd look at them and go, well, hang on, why would you have it better in your day? We've got cars now, we've got remote control TV, we've got the internet. They're not talking about those things, because when you look back in your life, you don't remember your laptop, or you don't remember, the material goods. They were actually talking about freedom. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is nanny state or laws or regulations are really sort of pulling people towards a system that is no longer free. And in saying that, will there be a rise, or will people just accept it? And I think that's the thing. And you bang on, your banking. So if I want to put something through my bank, I have to wait for my phone to light up and its authorization. Like I've said to me, I don't want my phone with me 24/7. Why do I need, a transhumanism piece of technology beside me to be able to do simple transactions?
Well, it's one of those things that, and I kind of struggle in some ways, because I sometimes describe myself as a digital native in an analog world, which is kind of a variation on a theme of most people talk about them being analog and analog. But in some ways, I almost think of myself as being from the future, because I actually I feel quite comfortable with a lot of the technologies that are here now. And a lot of people my age are getting quite worried. And I think it comes down to it's as you're saying, it's the convenience factor and that kind of thing. So one of the things that does bother me is how we are inextricably linking the ability to pay for things with our identity. Okay, so if you go into a pub and they ask you for your ID because they have to make sure that you're over the age to drink alcohol, all they should need to know is proof that you are old enough and that it's legal. What they don't need to know is what your passport is or what your driving license is. They don't need to know your date of birth. But the way that we tend to approach these things is to capture those pieces of information rather than, is it legal for me to drink somewhere, yes or no? And that's a very different thing. And this is where it's interesting you're saying about things being free. The old joke in social media, Facebook, Twitter, all this kind of thing, is when the product's free, that means you are the product.
Yeah. And
that's because you are constantly generating data about what you're clicking on, what you're liking, what you're sharing. And the social media companies are then using that data to resell it to other organizations. And they're making the money out of you and your behaviors. And you don't even notice it. And because it's not you having to hand money over, you feel comfortable with it. It doesn't feel like a cost. And so the whole thing of freedom has been eroded because we've given up our time and effort to use these kind of facilities. So that's where it's interesting you were saying about things like cryptocurrency and blockchain. They are radically different in that with those, you don't need to prove who you are in order to transact. You simply need to prove that you are authorized to do that transaction. And that's a subtle but important difference.
I remember a couple of years ago, there was the car NCT, or people will know it as MOT. And when I went in to the location, they said, can I have a look at some identification into the premises? And first I pulled out my passport. It says, we can't have a look at that because of, GDPR. And I went, okay. So then I pulled out this card that I had, and the card itself was out of date, but my picture is me and my date of birth is me, right? And I gave him that. He says, I can't accept that. I says, why? The card is out of date. I says, the card may be out of date, but my date of birth isn't out of date. And that card is reflecting my date of birth and it's showing who I am. But you're not acknowledging it because the card itself is out of date. And he looked at me. He knew I was right, and he didn't know what to say.
Sometimes the problem that we come against processes and procedures that people are just executing without any thought. I'm going through it at the moment. I've made a freedom of information request to an organization to get a copy of a recording of a phone call I made to them. And it was to do with opening a bank account. And I sent them details and said, I'd like a copy of this recording, please. Because it's all digital these days. And therefore, under GDPR, I've got a right to obtain a copy of the recording. But because the recording related to somebody else, but that somebody else wasn't on the call, the bank is now insisting that I provide them with a copy of that somebody else's identity details. I was like, hang on, you're asking me to break GDPR to fulfill your requirements. So you can see that They're just only following the rules type thing. It is not
common
a good
sense.
option.
I think we are lacking common sense, and people, it's a case of I can't cross the road until the green man flashes, but there's no cars in miles.
Yep.
And it's I think people need to just kind of go, okay, there's common sense here. It's like going back into the digital currencies and blockchain. I was all for it in probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago, thinking it's great, cash, brutal. I never use it. I have my card and, it helps me, and I don't take money out. I spend less because I'm tapping, and it keeps me a budget. So I'm terrible if I put €20, £20 or dollars in my pocket. When I pull it out, I lose it. So my wife was always giving out to me, going, is there any money in your pocket? Give it to me before you go out, because it'll end up on the street. And I was going, great. But then when it started to drive home, and I kind of, instead of sleepwalking through the whole process, I went, hang on, if we go a digital currency, that money that I have, someone gets a percentage of it. When the other person gets it, someone takes a percentage of it. There is a tracking mechanism on it as well. So if it's that 50 quid, out of that 50 quid, the person, I'll probably only be sending over to that person 48, I'm using an example, and they'll probably only receive 46. And I'm kind of going, where's that percentage of the money going? It's to the digital world. And I kind of went, that's not right. Because if you think about it, when we get paid, we then pay tax on it. The stuff we buy has VAT on it. There's other levies or whatever on it as well. And this is an extra charge that will be built into going down to the shop to buy a carton of milk, or whatever it may be. And I kind of went, no, we need to keep this cash in society, because if we let it go, we're going to have implications that we never thought we're going to.
There are definitely risks, and I often talk about what's known as the Cobra effect, and it's the law of unintended consequences. That's something you do something with good intent, but the actual result of it is something totally different. It's called the Cobra effect because of the story of, I think it was in Delhi many, many years ago in India. They had an issue with poisonous snakes in the area. And so the solution was to offer a bounty to people to bring in dead cobras. So they got them killing cobras. And of course, the problem with any incentive mechanism is that people will always work out how to use it to their advantage. And so some people started breeding cobras in order to be able to kill them off and sell them and make more money from the government. So eventually the government realized this was what was going and totally killed off the whole deal, upon which all the people who'd been breeding cobras said, well, what do I do these? And they threw them out on the streets, and therefore they had a worse problem than they started with. So, there is this law of unintended consequences. So we do need to be careful in how we do things. And that's why I think we have to do things bit by bit. So cash at the moment, generally around Europe, I think 85% of all transactions are digital in some way, but possibly even higher. So with COVID restrictions and that, it's dropped down even more, but cash is dying away. And I often hear this description of how it is that with digital money, everyone's taking a slice as it goes through the transactions and that. But they don't think, well, actually, how much does it cost the shop to manage a cash till? That they're having to pay for the management of the cash. They're having to pay for a member of staff to take it to a bank and vice versa and so on. So cash actually isn't as free to use as we think it is. It's just that we don't notice it. And so the shops build in the cost of cash transactions in the price of the goods we buy. So actually we're still paying a certain amount. It's just that we don't notice it. Now with a digital world, I'm going to go on the supportive of it for a minute. You can reduce that friction massively. The cost of moving ones and zeros, so the cost of moving digital data is insignificant. It's hardly anything at all. So actually, if you can do transactions which are at almost zero cost, then actually that's more efficient and cheaper and better for everybody. So I can see the positive of that. The risk, as you say, we start going down the kind of like surveillance state and the why do you need to have a copy of all my transactions or why do you need to know that? But that's a different story. But it's like, as I described with any other technology, we look at the aeroplane. I love aeroplanes. And aeroplanes are a form of technology. And if you use them in one way, then they help us all go on holiday to travel around the world or take goods and service or goods and products on there. Or you can strap bombs onto them and you can kill people. So technology depends who's using it and how it's used. But I think it can be used for the good of things.
Yeah, and another example of that is AI. In the wrong hands, it can do massive damage, and in the right hands, it can do great things in the world. But I also believe that it's free will, and I believe in free choice. So you were right that 85%. Now, in Ireland, there is a movement because one of the banks sent out saying we're no longer having cash machines in A, B, and C, and people went, what? And there was a huge movement, and there was boycotting on places that weren't accepting cash. There's places that were only accepting cash, and there has been like a revivement, that people are now using cash where they can. So the bank shot themselves in the foot. However, in saying that, I believe that we should have two. And for me, it's my free choice as a sovereign human being to be able to accept the digital or to have the cash. And yes, there is a cost element to a shop having it, but there's a cost element for a shop to have everything. I used to look at it years ago going, okay, well, there's safety that, a bank robber or a shop robber won't come in and ask for cash and run out the door. And I thought that was the safety element of it. But, mother of invention, and people will find a way. And I know there is very intelligent people out there within the crypto space that are already creating digital currencies that will be outside of government regulations when we go digital.
Yeah, and that's where we're already seeing that happening, and we're already seeing governments and regulators frantically trying to put in place regulation to manage that situation. And what they've done up till now is quite interesting, that they're not actually regulating the cryptocurrencies themselves. They're regulating what I describe the on-ramps and the off-ramps. So this is if I've got a €50 note, how do I convert that into Bitcoin or something? And in order to do that, I usually need to go through a bank. Banks are now saying, well, we won't connect you to a crypto exchange because they blacklist lots of them. And certainly in some countries, it's getting harder and harder to actually get a bank account where you can actually transact with a cryptocurrency capability. And that's because the government's putting in things. And again, they're saying things like, oh, this is to do with anti-money laundering and proceeds of crime and all this kind of stuff. But when you actually look at the data, and I always say, I do a lot of presentations and lectures around blockchain and crypto and that. And I always open up with big lines of, this is not financial, legal, or criminal advice. Because the most popular form of money laundering remains used US dollar bills in a suitcase. Now, everyone thinks that's the domain of Hollywood and films of aeroplanes flying around with bags of cash. That actually still happens in places, and it's still the most effective way. But they will argue that is why you're having to restrict access to crypto, because it's all criminals who are using it. So you're right. There's some clever people who are working out ways of using technology to do stuff.
Yeah, and the reason why banks are putting these stipulations in is because they're losing money. They feel they're losing money, and they're kind of going, at that level, it's cutthroat. And it's going, well, let's put in a law or a regulation. But do you remember when crypto first kicked off really a couple of years ago? I remember people going to the banks and the bank going, no, we won't transfer that into your coin or whatever it may be. And people had to go to, is it Northwest or North? What's the money transaction shops? They have them in the States and all. You can transfer money.
MoneyGram or something like that.
Yeah, probably. Something like these that were going in. And now the banks have got smarter and they've kind of saying, okay, we can do this. But now they're putting tracks on it. But someone will come up with something else, and there'll be cases where people will not want to be changing money into fiat. They'll be doing transactions among themselves in whatever currency they choose.
Yeah.
And if you look at Lebanon at the moment, as you know, they've shut down the banks. They've offered people, I think it was 33% on whatever they had in savings. But they were banning people from using cryptocurrency as well in Lebanon.
So this is, again, I was going to quickly say, it's another example of the law of unintended consequences. Like governments and regulators put in place controls that are meant to help protect people. What that is people to use, because they're going to do these things anyway. So they want to do transactions, they are going to do it. And by regulating in a certain way, what then happens is that it means people have to then go to the more dodgy providers. And so in some ways it increases the risks.
Well, then is it a case, okay, honourable agreed. And if you go into the Lebanon, there was people trading the US dollar on the black market because there was more money than their own currency. And they were finding ways around to use cryptocurrencies. So it's inevitable. It is changing. It is happening. I don't think Klaus Schwab and his World Economic Forum gang can stop what they don't want. And on the other side, I don't think the other side, whatever that is, can't stop what they're trying to do.
I think it does come down to, as you say, people need choices and we need options. I'm one of those people who I don't like it when I only have one option, because that's not an option. When something is mandatory, even if I support it, it pulls the hackles on the back of my neck, because I do think we need choice. And that's one of the things, it goes back to the standard human thing of you always need choices, options, and this kind of thing. So I think you're right that we are going to end up with like the ever more regulated world and the ever more libertarian world. But as long as the two can coexist, that's kind of okay in my mind. It's when one tries to say, well, the other won't exist. That's where you've got this polarization going on. And that's where you get conflict, and that's where you get trouble.
Are you struggling to grow your business? Book a free business growth consultation with Joe today. In this consultation, you'll receive professional advice, step-by-step guidance that will help you achieve success. Best practices and tips for improving profits. Clicking on the link in the description or contacting us directly.
I hope that there's an opportunity for both to exist. Right now, crypto just isn't big enough in its size. I mean, the market capitalization, so how much money is in crypto, is, I think it's around about $1 trillion, which sounds like a big number. It's
you wouldn't mind having it in your bank account.
Well, exactly, yeah. But compared to world trade, which is multi-trillion daily, crypto's a fly in the ointment. It's tiny at the moment, but banks and governments are definitely recognizing that it's got the potential to grow. I take an interest in crypto not because of what prices are doing, but I look at how much it's being adopted and accepted and how many people are getting into it. And that keeps growing. And we only need to look at things like, you were mentioning AI before. So most people probably heard of ChatGPT, which is the latest version of an AI that does all sorts of clever things where you ask it questions and it comes back with stuff. the number of subscribers that ChatGPT got was something like 10 million in 3 months. So in terms of user adoption, that's an off-the-scale rate. If you think about how many people started buying cars originally when they came out, and then how many people bought into social media or whatever, it grew and grew. But the rate of adoption explodes. And so I think banks are realizing that with crypto, there is the risk that even though it's only a small thing at the moment, it may grow rapidly. And they're mindful as well. If you look at Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin's probably the best known crypto. The paper that describes Bitcoin has written into it a comment about its main goal is to provide a means for peer-to-peer transfer of value without an intermediary. And you go, well, what does that mean? And it's like, well, ultimately it means you can pay someone else without going via someone else. So you don't need a bank, you don't need a building society, you don't need any of the payments providers, which for you and I is brilliant. We're getting rid of the intermediary, so that's a great way of reducing cost. But if you are the intermediary, you're going to feel threatened. And so that's why the banks are taking a great interest in crypto. And some of them are adopting it themselves. So some of the banks are actually the biggest filers of patents around blockchain and crypto technology because they've realized that this is going to be the future.
Yeah, it's like you see the big financial trading houses in Wall Street, an article, crypto dead, don't touch it. And then next week they're creating their own, so even with themselves, they're very unclear and there's a lot of uncertainty on it as well. But it's interesting that you said it's peer-to-peer, and that's what it really is meant to be. It's peer-to-peer without someone dipping into your pocket. So it's like me walking down to the shop and buying a bag of potatoes, and as I walk home, someone comes along and takes 3 potatoes out of it. What was that for? Oh, that was the pleasure of walking up the road. So, normal household, do they care?
I don't think they care. And most people are interested in, firstly, convenience, and secondly, security. And I say it in that order because if you say to people, they will just assume that things will be secure, because this is why we tend to have governments and regulators to make things safe and secure. So you don't even think about that. But if you can make something convenient for somebody, they will adopt it. It's the path of least resistance. And so this is where I've worked in many organizations where they've been implementing things and they've said, how can we force our users to use this? It's like, well, if you're going to use the word force, then you've got a problem already. You want them to want to use it. And people want to use things that simple, easy, quick, effective, and cheap. And you notice I didn't even mention safe there. It kind of comes at the end. So I think that for normal people, they don't really care. These days, everyone's got, a mobile phone with a banking app on it, or a lot of people do. Do they care if that banking app is doing the transaction in euros, in dollars, in Bitcoin? Doesn't matter, does it? It's value transfer. And this is a fascinating thing about money and currencies and all that kind of thing. All they allow is a means of transferring value. I bought something, I paid for it. Do I care what unit of measure you use? I was doing a fair amount of traveling before the lockdowns, and I had a payment card that you went into any country and you paid with that card, and you didn't have to worry about whether it was in dirhams, dollars, scudos, or whatever. It just did it for me. Fantastic. I didn't give any thought about that, but that was so convenient, and so I used it.
One thing I've noticed that there's a younger generation who now have it on their phone, and they go everywhere and they tap their phone. And there was one case of people, they were on holidays and their phone broke, and they didn't have any cards, so they had to come home early.
Yep.
And I'm kind of going, you have people out people in their 20s are out having fun in the city, and they're hitting a nightclub, and the battery runs out on their phone. It's over for them. The night is over. They can't spend any more money, and they go home.
Yeah. Have you ever lost a wallet?
Yeah, and it's the same as losing a wallet, but you're kind of going, you're depending on electricity in a way, your own, to do this, where if you just have your card. And I'm kind of going, we've come a society that people are, and I'm showing my phone to people who can't see me, that we're depending on this digital plate to be able to survive and live.
Yeah.
Which is completely wrong.
So let's extend that a bit further for a minute and get people either excited or really worried. Because you're right, everyone's got a mobile phone these days, or most people have mobile phones. I know that's wrong to make such an assumption. And you're right that if the mobile phone becomes unavailable, you can't pay for things, you can't prove your ID in that. What's the one thing that you do carry around with you that can be used to validate your identity? It's your face. You've always got your face, okay? So there's been
going to say fingerprint, but yeah, face.
well, yeah, but face is even better than fingerprints. But put them together is really, really good. So there's been some work being done in England, in the north of England, with some chain stores around using facial recognition software for payments. And again, this is one of those things that you go, well, actually, if I just look into a camera and it can work out who I am and it can automatically do a balance transfer, then if I've lost my phone, it doesn't matter anymore. How simple and easy is that? It's absolutely, fantastic from a convenience point of view, but from a dystopian point of view, those of us who are a little bit older, the alarm bells start going off quite rapidly there, because we can see what the next thing is from that. The next thing, we only need to look at what happens in China now, where they've got mass surveillance for monitoring and tracking people. They've linked that into what's called the SRI system, which is the Social Responsibility Index, I think it is, where they can track people, they can identify them, they're doing facial payments already. But what you can now do with the system, I believe, is that they can stop people from being able to buy and sell things. Because obviously, if you're linked into a central system where your face is your identity, then they can say, well, you're a bad guy, we're not going to let you do something. Again, there's kind of good stuff about that. You go, wow, that's really impressive. But if the government decides what bad is, and bad might simply be, I spoke to Joe on this subversive program, then I get a black mark, and now I'm not allowed to spend any money. So again, there's two sides to the coin here, and I fear at times George Orwell got the ideas right. He just got the dates wrong, because it does feel as we've walked into that world.
Yeah, and it's, looking at that world with China, they have a quantum computer that basically ties everyone up. And if you cross the road and you're jaywalking, you get that mark. And so it feeds into your social credits. Mm-hmm. And you can even see there's even some language coming out here to help businesses. And it's about, how companies can be better and sustainability. And when you read the language, it's actually, when you're reading it, it's the people that are introducing this and talking about it. It's World Economic Forum language, but it's also social credits. And people don't realize this. And people are going, oh, yeah, and you get credits toward this in your revenue. And I go, that's basically, that's really not good. Yep. And if you talk to people about it, they'll say, oh, that's conspiracy. But it's not. It's reality that you could be going down a route that if you're not a good boy, whoever makes those rules up, you will be penalized. And
I was going to quickly say that the definition I heard recently of a conspiracy theorist is someone who knows the truth 6 months before the rest.
Yeah.
And it does at times kind of turn out that way. So you're right that there is about to be another currency, and people don't realize that it's even going to exist. And that currency is carbon credits. And this whole thing, exactly as you say, if you look at companies' annual reports, if you look in their plans, you look in government things, it's all about reducing our carbon footprint. And you go, well, what do you mean by that? And this is where already companies are now having to calculate what the equivalent carbon use is of, a flight or a purchase or whatever. Well, again, law of unintended consequences, once you start capturing that, you can put a price on it. And again, the noble principle about that is that you can incentivize people to behave in ways that are environmentally friendly. Or the dystopian way is that you use it as a mechanism to say, no, you can't go on holiday this year because you've already used your carbon allowance.
That brings up where they're introducing 15-minute cities. Like I've seen an article in one of the cities, I think it's in Nottingham or Norwich, want to break the city into 4 or 5 different regions and then be able to, commute or travel among in certain parts. And you're looking at these and going, people, they're not really understanding that they're building their own prison around them.
And in fact, Oxford is one of the places where that's happening. And
Oxford, yes.
And there's some big protests happening because people are beginning to wake up to the whole thing of, actually, you're saying this is to provide an ultra low emission zone. What it's actually doing is controlling things. So in the UK, they're introducing all sorts of things. As you say, there's several of these 15-minute schemes. There's also talk about reducing the speed limits even more, so that the speed limit might be 20 miles an hour, which all of a sudden that means you can't go very far anyway. So again, you can see where these things could lead to quite dark places. And ultimately, again, Cobra effect, law of unintended consequences, it might actually be that something that is being done with ostensibly good intent actually has a dramatically bad effect. So I'm a believer that we need to reduce pollution, but I don't believe that carbon is pollution. And so why are we even looking at reducing carbon?
Yeah, if you look at, like, we're made of carbon, and if you want to really reduce it, get rid of us. And I believe there's multinationals buying up farmland in Ireland to plant forests and then to use that forest as part of their corporate identity to offset the carbon that they're going to build within their organization or producing something.
Yep.
So it's the man, woman in the street that will have to pay a fee. But it's also, you're dead right, it isn't about carbon, it's pollution. But nobody is talking about it. No one is saying, how do we reduce pollution? Because if you start looking at pollution, it's then focusing on the big organizations that are making X amount, billions, that are causing the pollution and not man, woman in the street.
Yeah. And it's something I always urge caution when people talk about net zero, because net means that you're actually subtracting one number from another in order to come up to zero. So that means actually, exactly as you say, if you're a big company and you buy a forest, you can now use that to offset all the pollution you're generating. So you've now no need financially to reduce your pollution. So it's not solving the pollution problem. This is where I said ages ago, around London, the London mayor introduced a low pollution zone, and they're now extending it. It's the ULEZ, so I think think it's the ultra low emission zone where it's very expensive to go into town. If you want to reduce your pollution from cars, just ban them. But you don't, because you're using them as a form of revenue. You're taxing them instead. So I think at times we're looking at doing things the wrong way.
Well, the EU came out and said they want to ban petrol and diesel cars by 2035. And these are, sometimes I think people just speak these words without actually thinking. And you're going, okay, so you want to do that. So what are you going to use to fuel the factories? So you're going to ban cars, but they said that, we still will be using this in manufacturing, and we'll still be using it in our private jets, and we'll still be using it in all this. The only thing we're just going to stop cars, you driving your petrol or a diesel car. And you know, like, it's nonsense. It's someone in Europe with a strike of a pen goes, yes, it's now law. And I'm kind of going, hang on. People need to understand that it's civil servants, which means they are a servant to the people, not they are above the people and tell the people what to do. The people are above them. So it's man, woman, system, civil servants. This is the way it should go, not the other way around. But I think people forget that.
I think it comes back to, it was interesting, Elon Musk was being interviewed the other day about how do we need to educate our children differently? And instead of him saying things like, teach them how to program computers, whatever, he said, teach them critical thinking, teach them the ability to question and to question the answers that they get. So you take a look at, as you say, that the EU mandate that petrol cars won't be available for sale from 2035. I used to work in the oil trading industry. And one of the things that people don't seem to realize about oil is petrol is almost a byproduct that you get. So you extract a barrel of oil, and from that barrel of oil, the majority of it's going to use for crude oil. So you're going to use that for powering, your power stations, your ships, this kind of thing. Then you've got light oil, so you might use that for lubrications. You've got kerosene for aeroplanes. So a barrel of oil, once you refine it and everything, you get a whole range of different products out of it. And petrol is not one of the primary products. It's kind of like a
byproduct.
Yeah, that's right. So what are they going to start doing with all this byproduct that no one's consuming anymore? What are they going to do? They're just going to burn it off like they do with gas? We don't know. So it's one of these things that unless they're actually going to reduce crude oil consumption, then there's no point reducing petrol. So it's again, I think society's being driven down a certain direction without a little bit of critical thinking around that.
I teach my children to be critical thinkers, and to this point when they say something and I say, because I say so, well, you're telling me to question everything, so I'm questioning you. And I go,
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think what's going on, it's theatre. I think it's a play on stage, saying what wants to be said, and everyone rallying around, you could say saving the planet and causing fear without actually looking at, okay, how do we really save the planet? You're saying this, get rid of this, get rid of coal, get rid of that smoking, but okay, what's behind that? And I think there's a play on words, there's a play on laws. I think it's control. The man, woman in the street are the ones that are going to be affected, and other people are going to make more money out of it. And I think people need to wise up in a way and go, okay, these rules, regulations are coming on board, but I need to question them, because everybody's taking everything at face value. Everyone's believing everybody's word. And you said it there that, a minute ago, is that, if we don't do this, if we don't question it, we're, as you said, we're going to give up an awful lot. And then
it comes down as well that I'm always nervous of any regulation or legislation that is preventative in nature. Anything that bans something or prevents something, and unless there's a really strong argument for it, then I don't think we should generally ban things. Regulation and legislation should be enabling. It should be allowing you to do what you want to do, not stopping you from doing it. And anything that either prevents you from doing something or offers a financial incentive for you to behave differently, I always get cautious about. So years ago, there was the EU subsidies on wind farms. And so there was massive amounts of money being ploughed in that you could get government aid if you had a wind farm. And so as a result, people chop forests down to put wind farms because they got the grant aid. Well, anything that is good should not need a subsidy. It should naturally just be beneficial in some way. So I'm always suspicious of anything where there are financial incentives to do something or financial disincentives to not do something.
If it's a law, it's because they want you to do it. And I always love the way if they want something and if you don't do it, they fine people and they create big fines because people know if it hits them in the pocket, it'll hurt them the most. So they use this stick to beat people with.
Carrot and stick's fine as long as it gets some carrot sometimes.
Yeah. Or it's the stick is so far that you'll never get the carrot. Yeah. The question I have, where do you think it's all going? Or is there, the Bell's curve? Is there more and more people becoming conscious to ask the right questions? So where do you think it's all going, good or bad?
Yeah, so we look at how technology gets adopted, and ultimately that's what we're talking about. It's about the adoption of technology in various forms, whether that's technology to enable money and payments, that kind of whatever. Technology tends to follow a certain trajectory in that it always takes longer than we expect it to get into place, but then it has a bigger difference. It makes a bigger impact. So we look at the internet. The internet's probably about 50 years old now. Compared to ARPANET and how it was originally, it's taken 50 years for it to really start transforming how we do things and how businesses operate. So I think we're going to see more and more of this stuff coming along, but we're not going to see it make that much of a difference yet. And then suddenly we'll wake up one day and it'll be a different world. I really do think things will happen quickly. And it came home to me a while ago. Somebody said to me, if you think that the world is getting faster and faster every day at the moment, then that means that today is the slowest it's ever going to be for the rest of your life. And that kind of, for the audience, I can see this facial expression of concern from Joe here. It's quite a mind-provoking thought that it really does mean that the world is going to get faster and faster. So today is the slowest it's going to be. So the whole idea of stop the world, I want to get off is absolutely valid. And this is where we need to start thinking about the impact on people's lives, mental health, a far broader range of things. So in terms of where do I think it's going to go, I don't think it's going to have as much of an impact as we think it will for a while. But then something's going to happen suddenly, a little bit like we were mentioning ChatGPT, the new AI facility earlier on. That kind of appeared from nowhere almost overnight, or it appeared to. It'd actually been in development for several years. And already companies are beginning to use it without actually knowing how it works or what it does. But they're using it to write scripts, to write videos, all this kind of thing. So I think my suggestion is that things aren't going to change too radically, but then they're going to suddenly radically change. And that's where you carry the risk of when people abruptly change, that's where you get conflict and disagreements and that kind of thing. That's where that's going to have to be managed very carefully.
I think with AI, it's like drones killed helicopter pilots. And I think AI is going to really do damage to the copyright industry. And the only real, true, authentic stories that will be written are people writing their own stories. about their own experiences about, and they will be the authentic, and everything else will just be, like there's more information dumped on the internet every day than there was, over a 40-year period that was written. So I think it's moving quickly. However, I do believe that there is a shift, and I think arrogance will be the downfall of governments, you could call it, or globalists, whoever, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, again, this is the thing. It carries the risk of ending in conflict, and governments generally like conflict that they're not in control of. They like it where they are. But yeah, the whole thing around authenticity is a subject of its own right. About the creative industries, whether that's writing or video or whatever, are about to be quite heavily hit by AI. So I'm already seeing some Hollywood film studios who are using AI to make Harrison Ford, who I think is now 80, look like his younger self for the next film or something. And it's incredible. And you can't tell that it's fake. It does look like they've pulled out old video footage. Wow. So authenticity is going to be interesting, of how do we prove that something is authentic in general? Because you can get AI to write a fictional story now as though it is an 80-year-old who lived through the Second World War, who experienced blah, blah, blah. It could all be a totally imagined thing, and there's no way of knowing.
It's like you can see digital work out there where they're pretending to be Obama or pretends to be someone, and the guy's talking, and you see the image of the president talking in his voice. So I think, again, don't look at everything at face value. Question everything. And if you really are unsure, I think it's about using your intuition and your gut feeling to guide you.
I think Ronald Reagan used a phrase when he was doing the nuclear arms talks, which is trust but verify. And what was interesting about that was it was actually from a Russian phrase, a Russian folklore type thing that effectively comes out as trust but verify. These days, I'll go even further and say don't particularly trust, but definitely verify.
I have learned over the last couple of years, Gary, that the forest will give us everything and will provide. Everything else is just theatre.
Yep.
On it. I think our conversation will need to reconnect again. But tell me, if someone wants to reach out to you or someone wants to connect with you, where can they find you, Gary?
The easiest way is just go on to whatever your favourite search engine is and type in Gary Nuttall Emerging Technology, and I usually fill the first page, and you can get in touch via LinkedIn, email. It all appears on the web from there. So that's the easiest way.
The easiest way. And yeah, I think we haven't even touched on blockchain. That's the thing. We said we'd meander to wherever we were going, but we have on it.
A topic for another day.
Another day. Gary, thanks for coming on. Thank you.
Pleasure.